Welcome, Chris. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Microsoft Research, where you'll be giving a distinguished AI seminar later today. And for the audience, Chris is the Seibel Professor of Machine Learning at Stanford University, where he has an appointment in both linguistics, computer science. You head the Stanford AI Lab, and you've recently become a part of the Stanford Human-Centered Computing Initiative, the HI effort.
Yes, indeed. That's all correct.
So
Thanks for having me here.
You wear many hats, and one of the things that I've loved about your career is its focus on statistical NLP, ranging from work on parsing to grammar induction to lots of applications in information retrieval and machine translation and stuff. You're amazingly well-respected and successful. You have more than 100,000 citations, I think, 2 very popular textbooks. You're a fellow of the ACM, the AAAI, ACL, is that right? So again, your breadth shows in terms of the venues and the many awards you've received. I want to start by getting a little bit of insight about how you got started in this area. You did your undergraduate degree at ANU, the Australian National University, and if your webpage is correct, you majored in linguistics, computer science, and math. Yes. So can you say a little bit about how you combine that computational perspective on language, seemingly from a very early age?
Sure. Yeah. So, I guess from an early age, I, on the one hand, like doing things with computers, but I also sort of almost by chance saw a little bit of linguistics and decided that the structure of human languages was really a pretty neat thing. And so that led, as an undergrad, from the beginning, I did this combination of linguistics and computer science and math. So the funny detail there is I actually did this all in an arts degree, because I guess the way things were at the ANU, if you did science, it didn't have engineering, and if you did science, you had to do physics and chemistry. And whereas in an arts degree, they were happy to let me do math, computer science, and linguistics, so I did that.
I see. So math and computer science fell in arts at the ANU?
Well, no, they were in science, but the arts degree was very flexible.
It's interesting. I have a similar background in math and cognitive psychology, and again, it was partly because I was fascinated that you could use computational techniques to describe things like memory and learning. Was there a particular course or project that you worked on that piqued your interest in language?
Yeah, so really my thinking linguistics was a cool thing, kind of. It happens from a chance thing in high school.
Okay.
I guess there was an English classroom that happened to have an intro linguistics text that I started looking at one day, and it introduced the idea of you could have the International Phonetic Alphabet and sort of use it to describe the pronunciation of any language in the world, and then introduce the idea of phonemes, of how that there's certain there's distinctive symbols in languages, so that even though there's finer-grained variation how people pronounce things, that there are distinctions that count as the sort of set of sounds of a language. And this kind of, both from the background of all the irregularity of English spelling that you work on as a young student, but also just sort of seeing this scientific approach to this study of language, that somehow struck me as, that's really neat. And so, really actually in my first semester at ANU, I took the Intro to Linguistics class.
Okay. So, my path was a little different. I started out in math and only later discovered amazing applications. But so I wanted to talk a little bit about the first of your books on the foundations of statistical NLP. It's probably the first time that I read a fair amount of your work. One of the things that I really liked about that book, and this was in 1999, I believe, with Henrik Schuetze.
Yes.
And I really liked the fact that it focused on corpus-based work, which I think was probably at the beginning of its course in NLP. It also had a section which I really liked. This was the same time we did the work on LSI, on language learning, lexical acquisition. And so those two were foundational chapters in the book. And I also liked, of course, the applications to machine translation and information retrieval. So there was a lot of overlap in in that work, which I have right here, and some of my own work at the time. why did you write the book? What was it that was missing in textbooks, or that you wanted to get your head around as you wrote that book?
Sure. Well, yeah, what's missing was easy, that there was just about nothing of that sort. So, I mean, really, both Henrik and I had come from the then kind of traditional background in natural language processing and linguistics, where there were handwritten, rule-based descriptions of lexicons and grammars, and parsing was done in terms of those grammars, and that there was some kind of formal semantic ideas of meaning representation, and then we'd started to see this world, so there were sort of early explorations of once sort of text started to become available digitally in large quantities, of seeing empirically what you could do with large quantities of text. And because of that, at that stage, having the kind of requisite computing was still a challenge. A lot of that work effectively happened at big research labs, so really IBM research and AT&T research were the most prominent two places where it happened. But we were both on the West Coast at that time, and so there was also a small group at Xerox PARC that was exploring that approach, and so I guess that's sort of how we got involved in that at first. And so we were both excited by those new ideas. For directly writing the book, I mean, for me, the motivation was essentially that after I graduated with my Ph.D., my first job was at Carnegie Mellon University, and because I'd had a little experience doing statistical NLP work, but really not very much, they asked me to teach a course on that, because that was now what the students wanted, reflecting some of these recent developments, and there wasn't any such course. And so I started teaching a course, and that was sort of an obvious lead-in to the textbook. And so a bit before us, there had been one short text that Eugene Charniak had written on statistical language learning, but we felt that the coverage of that was sort of fairly limited. It covered some of the kind of core algorithms for HMMs and PCFGs for tagging and parsing, but just about nothing outside of that. So we wanted to write a broader book that talked about doing empirical approaches to NLP and looking at things that included lexical semantics and how to do statistical NLP work. So, I mean, effectively, at the time, we were looking to write a book that complemented the existing NLP books. So I guess at that point, there was James Allen's text on natural language processing, and there was another one, it was with Chris Mellish and someone in Mellish. I'm a little forgetting now, but they had a book on natural language processing at either Prologue or
I see. Again,
List.
sort of...
Was it Gazda Mellish or someone? Oh, it's hard to remember now. And so at the time, we really saw ourselves as this was sort of the complementary book that represented the other half of the picture of the new work that was being developed. I mean, of course, what happened fairly quickly is that statistical approaches to NLP took over the whole field, and it started to become the book people used rather than a complementary book.
Right. So you talked a little bit at the beginning about NLP being maybe a sequential box model where there was lexicon, syntax, semantics, and parsing and semantics. Did this book start bridging some of those, or blurring the lines between those formally distinct processing stages in language understanding?
I think not so much when it comes down to it, because I think a lot of what was being done in statistical NLP is that people were taking those boxes and doing things in it that could be done. So
I see.
that you were doing lexical semantic work, you were determining parts of speech, you were trying to get a syntactic structure for a sentence.
I see.
That it hadn't really become anything that was unified as a whole.
Okay, so to me, one of the big insights in the book was that you could do a lot from the analysis of large-scale text corpora, which were really just becoming available. And fast forward 20 years, we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the the deep learning revolution.
Yeah,
but
so I think that was a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
And, it was why initially, Henrik and me, but really lots of people got just so excited when these statistical NLP techniques or corpus-based techniques started to be explored on large amounts of digital text, because we had been brought up on sort of handwritten rules and lexicons, and that language understanding was impossibly hard, and
it is hard.
AI complete task. And there's a way in which that's true, but there was this very appealing way that if you took millions of words of text, and in those days we were only doing millions of words of text, we weren't yet on to billions of words of text, and you just did really dumb, simple statistical stuff. I mean, effectively you just counted stuff, that you could get all of this really interesting information. You could build simple statistical models to do things like predict word senses, or to work out what arguments different verbs take. And that was like an appealing drug, that there was this new way in which you could start learning knowledge of language just by doing fairly simple operations over a body of text.
Right. When we think about acquisition of vocabulary or syntax in kids, a lot of it is inductive, right? Certainly we all, at least when I was growing up, would diagram sentences. But you also learn a lot by listening and talking, and so that is very much the same sort of thing that you can do in corpus linguistics, I guess. So a few years later, you worked with Daniel Ramage on some work that I really found very interesting. So it first looked at topic modeling, applied actually to very, very interesting work on the scientific literature. But you also at that point started combining more structural or semantic information in some of the work on supervised topic models. Can you talk a little bit about the blending of those two perspectives? So there's maybe the bottom-up inductive perspective, and then we know something about the structure of language, or at least this particular task.
Sure. So the context of this was, at that point, I was involved in more of a using NLP for social science project, and in particular we were looking at the development of multidisciplinary science, and in some sense that's not a direction I've kept on with, because some people have continued to be very involved in social science applications of NLP, where in some sense I did it for sort of a period of 4 or 5 years and then moved back into more core NLP areas. But it was, as soon as you're in the context of an application, you want something that actually works and does something useful, rather than something that is mathematically nice in the same way. So preceding that work, there'd been work by David Bly, Michael Jordan, on developing latent Dirichlet allocation, which was an unsupervised method of topic modeling, which had captured a lot of attention, because you could work in an unsupervised manner and take a lot of text, and it would give you a kind of a multi-clustering based on the words in the text, which seemed a useful inductive way to get a sense of what a text collection meant. But the problem with it was that, like a lot of clustering methods, you got some sort of clusters of words and concepts, but they had no labels. They didn't necessarily correspond to how humans thought about conceptualizing the world, and that there was very little way to control what came out apart from reinitializing all of your clusters and rolling
again.
the dice again and seeing if you liked it better than previously. And so what we were wanting to do is provide a tool that was more more connected up with human conceptualization and more controllable. And so we came up with this almost paradoxical idea, which we called labeled latent replay allocation. So having taken this unsupervised method and making it semi-supervised. And so the idea was that in many human domains, there's an existing classification. So the first thing we did it on was across science, and so academia has departments, or fields have journals, and those give a classification of different areas and topics, and you can think of many other areas, such as in the biomedical sciences, or just in industry groupings where there are these classifications. And so our idea was we could use documents that had already been assigned classes to say, well, look, here is a document, this will allow you to learn about this class, and you do that for thousands of documents. And then we can run it on documents and say, okay, look at the language of this document and which parts of it are reflective of a particular topic, where our topics now have names. And so we can look at computer science documents and say, well, which of them are talking about biology, or are talking about linguistics, or are using information theory methods, by looking for those topics as appearance in a document, by then running it as an unconstrained latent replay analysis problem.
So really it was in some ways combining the best of classification, sort of labeled classification problems with classification and clustering, right? So you put some structure on the problem and then took advantage of the broader statistics as well.
Right, and so in some ways it was a simple idea, but it's actually something that's proved to be very successful, because I think there were just a lot of people in precisely that case that if they just ran LDA, it was sort of intriguing what came out, but you got these unconstrained and unlabeled clusters, but actually there was already some kind of human classification of their world, and that this gave them a better tool for working with their documents to sort of understand relationships in domains.
It's very interesting. When I did some of the early work at Microsoft in text classification, we had some labeled data, we learned classes, and one of the things that the team we were working with wanted was the ability to say sometimes, I don't care what your model says, this item is in this class. And so in many ways it harkens back to, again, combining some priors on the world and more inductive techniques. So perhaps the biggest change that's happened in natural language processing in lots of other areas over the last decade or so has been the deep learning revolution.
Yes.
And it was starting, I guess, 2011-ish, when Jeff and Hinton and others showed how speech, which was a well-trodden area, could be improved dramatically and startlingly from my perspective, using large amounts of data in unsupervised fashions to work in vision a few years after. Those were both interesting low-level perceptual tasks. And one of the things that has happened over the last 5 or 6 years is looking at the extent to which some of those amazing accomplishments that were driven by large amounts of data, large amounts of compute, and richer representations and richer models apply to language. Language is very different in many ways. It's discrete. I think machine translation was probably, that you were involved in to some extent, was the first case where deep learning models influenced linguistic tasks. Beyond that, it's been a little bit slower progress. Can you say a little bit about your journey in looking at large, or just thinking about deep learning in the context of language analysis and understanding?
Sure. Yes, so, I mean, it's certainly right that the early huge wins of deep learning, and perhaps the domain in which deep learning is best suited, or at any rate the ones where it was sort of seen to be applicable and explored first were in these perceptual tasks like speech recognition or in vision for object recognition or other kinds of signal analysis that's already been used. And so that's a very natural space where you'd like to have a powerful associative device that can look at patterns and work things out and transform them into some higher level representation, and the general deep neural network story of having many layers which effectively increasingly abstract and get out a high level signal is very natural. So at first sight it indeed isn't quite so obvious that that's so well suited to language processing when you're working at the higher level, where, for instance, if you have text, or at any rate, you already have sequences of words in a sentence. Because effectively, languages have these symbols which are words, and those symbols are already concepts, right? That they're human-built abstractions of what are useful clusterings, useful conceptual notions in the world. And so this sort of base level of neural network processing seems like it's not needed. But what people then started to sort of explore is that for many things, symbols aren't great. In particular, they don't have any natural notion of similarity, that words and their meaning have a notion of similarity, but the symbols give you no entree into it. And I mean, that's something that had been explored a couple of decades earlier, and indeed, Sue, you were involved in that. So around 1990, there was a lot of work about could we convert words into a vector space representation, which was then being explored by doing latent semantic indexing or latent semantic analysis, where you were using linear algebra, singular value decomposition techniques to produce a vector representation of word meaning. You can tell your own story, but I think it's true to say that at that time it was, slightly successful. There were some intriguingly positive results, but it sort of somehow wasn't quite successful enough that it could displace traditional methods of information retrieval. So really what happened around 2010 was starting to be a return to those ideas, but using newer and more flexible or more powerful neural network methods to come up with vector representations of word meaning. And so when that emerged in the early 2010s, I guess there'd been enough of a gap that it seemed like a new idea again, but it also immediately seemed a very powerful, successful idea, that it sort of seemed like in the first half of the 2010s that you could take any well-worked natural language processing problem and add distributed vector representations of words, and simply the fact that they gave this powerful notion of word similarity let you get an extra 2% performance on your problem, and that's the kind of idea that's appealing to everyone in natural language processing.
So let me follow up on that. When we did LSI, it was really largely to overcome the vocabulary mismatch problem, where if the two of us use different words to describe very much the same concept, like doctor and physician, if they don't co-occur, you're not going to find the relevant objects. And so we were very much concerned in some sense about making zeros in a term by document matrix non-zero, and that results in embedding. I don't think we had broader linguistic notions than that. And so the technique, I think, was particularly successful when you had short queries and short documents. Not so much if you have a full document with hundreds of words matching it against another document. But as you alluded to, I want to talk about your glove work with Pennington and Socher in the mid 2014, 15.
That's when it came out,
And to me, one of the things that did is it brought together two perspectives. So there was sort of the linear algebra or counting perspective on representing or doing word embedding. And there was a newer notion that was introduced by Mikolov and many others on more predictive modeling. So given some pre-training objective, can I learn a a predictive model for language. And what you did in GLOVE is combine the two of those. Can you talk a little bit about doing that, the successes? And
absolutely. And that was precisely our goal, right? That on the one hand, there'd been this traditional work which had calculated matrices of, commonly it was word in document matrices, but there'd also been a line of work which actually Henrik Schuetze had been quite involved in, of doing word and word context matrices. And it seemed like that was the information that you wanted to compute these distributed word representations, and that was the right way to do it in some sense. But instead what had happened was that people, most famously at that point, there'd been Tomasz Mikolov and colleagues, word-to-vec model, had said, look, we can learn these word representations by coming up with a prediction task and repeating it over a few billion times, and we get these good word vectors. And in the original paper, not only was there no explicit formulation of the model as a model with a loss whatsoever, but it was all couched in this sort of iterative prediction language of coming up with word vectors. And we just felt that that was sort of wrong or missing the point, because it seemed like, well, there had to be a well-formulated model with a loss function, and that what this was computing should be an approximation to what you could compute directly by making use of a matrix of counts of words in context and then building a model about that. And so we were exploring how to do that. And I think showing that connection between prediction models and matrix-based factorization, in some sense what we were producing was a kind of a generalized LSI, you could say, was the real contribution of the paper. 5 or so years later, I mean, really, in practice, we produced a good set of word vectors that went alongside that paper. And so we have thousands of citations, mainly because lots of people have used our word vectors for all kinds of things. But I think the intellectual contribution was combining those two perspectives.
Let me touch on both of those points. So one of the things that at least in my mind happened in that paper is that you took a notion of both global context, sort of in the collection, as well as local word context. And it seems to me that the notion of having some global constraints has been lost a little bit in some of the more recent work. Is that your sense as well, or do you see some of that carrying over?
Yeah, I do agree that, you want to have both. That, the global context is good for overall topic or theme, and then local context captures much more sort of local what is happening in this particular clause and the syntactic structure nearby, yes.
Right. And do you think that some of the more modern large-scale word embeddings, things like BERT and GPT-2, have both of those perspectives, or are they mostly, that the pre-training tasks tend to be, I'd say, more local in nature? Is that a fair characterization, or do you think some of the more global perspectives that you have?
I mean, there's so many different sizes of global, but I think they actually are able to capture quite a lot of that. That since both of these models are transformer-based models, where the model for prediction can use as an attention distribution where it can look out, that it's capable in the attention distribution of both putting a lot of attention on very nearby words, which gives local context, and then a kind of diffuse averaging attention over a much bigger context. And so I actually think those models, and part of why they're powerful, is that they can do both of these things at once.
So the global constraints come from a larger span, rather than a larger collection.
Right.
And you iteratively induce the larger effects.
Right. So not global in the sense of a document collection, but large context in the context of an individual document. I think that can be captured.
Good. So I heard you give a keynote talk at SIG-IR in 2016 when you you claimed that the IR tsunami would hit information retrieval in 2017, and it certainly has. I haven't counted exactly, but my guess would be, more than half of the papers at recent SIG-IRs have used deep learning techniques to try to improve, retrieval in many ways. But at that talk, you argued for several things. One was that IR really needed to have deeper language understanding, that we were at a point where we had gone beyond 10 blue links. 10 blue links can cover up lots of inaccuracies because you let people do the filling in of the information. But more and more people wanted to do question answering. People wanted to work on mobile devices where you don't have the opportunity to present a page full of links and let people pick what they want. How do you think that journey is happening? How much language has been incorporated in retrieval models or deeper language understanding?
So I think, quite a bit. It's still
Okay.
it's still very much a journey that's in progress, right?
Yeah.
That if you're making search engine queries, there are clearly very many cases when you're getting no more than conventional information retrieval, and it's giving you an ordered set of links. But on the other hand, I think what the big search engine companies are doing is actually very clever in that people aren't trying to say, here's a full deep natural language processing solution, because the fact of the matter is that doesn't really work well enough yet, and there are all sorts of contexts where it isn't applicable, and we see that in the sort of limitations of things like conversational assistance. But if you can kind of gradually introduce it where possible, that you can start to see if you can understand more of a query, you can see if it seems to be a real question rather than just some stray keywords strung together, and if it is, to recognize that structure. So that there are now lots of places in the big search engines where you can put in some structure and you can say 10th President of the United States, and that's something that it can parse up and understand and know exactly the answer and give it to you, or you can ask for, husband of Beyonce and get something back for that. So it's sort of bottom up, starting to put in natural language understanding where it works, and I think people indeed are more and more expecting that, and clearly the transformative use case has been mobile.
That's right.
That regardless of whether it's still thumbing out the query or it's spoken, that even if you're typing out the query, you've still got this teeny screen, and you don't want to look at 10 links and then start reading 10 documents. You'd like the answer, and then even more so when people start speaking their queries, then they're way more likely to be real sentences with questions, and what people would like is to get the answers to them. And, I'll be honest, that's still a work in progress. I'm sure we've all tried our whatever it is, whether it's Alexa or Google Assistant or Siri, and half the time it doesn't work. But, on the other hand, half the time it does work, and that's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right that people's ambitions have changed. 20 years ago, it was startling to be able to type in 3 words and get anything that was sensible at all. And now we want to get specific information. We want to have, especially in mobile environments where you're speaking, have a longer standing conversation, not just one-shot deal. And so I think you're absolutely right. As people's needs and become more refined, the underlying technologies that are needed to support it really change. And so that's a tremendous progress.
I think that'll change even faster in the coming generation, right? Little kids who grow up today, expect all screens to be touchable and all devices to be able to be spoken to. And as that starts to permeate with those kids growing up, the pressure to actually be able to deliver on that vision, I think, will be really strong.
So I remember at the SIG-IR keynote, you said something like, so far we've seen the benefits of large-scale language analysis and in information retrieval really restricted largely to word similarity. And you argued very strongly for the need to, to think a lot more about memory, compositionality, and really and inference and reasoning. And you started on that journey. Can you say a little bit about some of the things you're excited about in supplementing simply knowing that doctor is related to physician with really richer ways of doing reasoning?
Sure. Right. So let me start off with the big picture, and maybe at the end
Okay.
I'll sort of touch back to information retrieval and search.
Yeah.
Right. So there was this enormous success of neural network methods in the domains we touched on earlier,
That's right.
of computer vision, object recognition, and speech recognition. And it was a little bit surprising that you could take those methods and move them to some things that seemed like higher level tasks. So something like language translation has normally been thought of a task that requires a lot of understanding of the world and understanding of sentences. But it was proven that once you had a lot of translated data, that you could take a kind of a signal processing approach to language translation that actually worked rather well. And so really a huge success of deep learning for natural language processing has been the building of neural machine translation models, which really only started to be developed around 2014, and sort of within 3 years they were so obviously better than what preceded them that all the big tech companies have moved to using neural networks for machine translation. So that was kind of impressive, but essentially all work in AI moved down to this lower level signal processing because it was exciting and successful. And there are older, higher level problems of AI, which is where you have knowledge and memory, and you're doing inferences and you're making plans, what Daniel Kahneman refers to as thinking slow,
That's right.
where you're doing more inferential processes. And in the 60s and 70s, that was sort of the main thing that people thought about in artificial intelligence. And not much of that was solved then, and not much of it has been solved lately, because to a large extent these problems were just ignored because there were these other problems that seemed approachable and exciting. And so the question at the moment is, well, can we take some of these successes in machine learning and neural networks and start applying them to these problems in higher level cognition to be able to create the kind of flexible intelligence where you can take facts compositionally, combine them, reason, and apply them to new tasks. And so that's an area that I've been interested in for the last few years, and have started doing work on seeing how can we try and build neural compositional reasoning engines, and have been trying to apply them to understanding tasks, some of it for language understanding. I've also been doing quite a bit of work in visual question answering, of combining vision and language. And I think that that's an exciting area, and there are interesting prospects to do that. I couldn't honestly say that that's yet been applied back to information retrieval.
Oh,
and
I don't
search.
care about information retrieval. Just some other. The world is not just information retrieval, even for me.
Eventually it should be, but there are hard challenges with information retrieval as to how to get the kind of scalability. You can start running things on hundreds of millions or billions of documents, but certainly have been starting to get results of being able to sort of use neural networks to do multi-step reasoning processes, which seems more like a higher level approach to cognition, and that seems an exciting direction to push.
So I can certainly see how you can bring in richer notions of memory, maybe attention in neural models. Do you think building and you're starting to look, as you said, right now at looking at multi-step inference or some kind of notions of reasoning. How do you think about that architecturally? Should that be part of the network, or should the network contain things like word similarities, and you combine those maybe in a fine-tuning process? Or where do you see one huge net doing everything that humans do, or do you see different core components, for example, word similarity, perceptual similarity?
These are interesting questions, and I think they're honestly still quite open, and it's hard to know how things will pan out, but I'll try a few answers anyway. I believe ultimately that we have to have models of intelligence which have different components and different parts, and there is a certain level of modularity. And while there's still very much about human brains, neuroscience that isn't known, I think it's nevertheless completely clear that human brains also have different regions and have clear modularity. There's some repurposability. There are these intriguing experiments where you can rewire brains and have different parts of brains can learn to do vision or can learn to do auditory processing. So there's clearly a lot of flexibility and plasticity, but there are also a lot of brain regions which seem to have clear roles. And so at the moment, there's sort of a tension. On the one hand, in the last few years, the most successful way to make progress in deep learning models, I think in general, certainly for natural language processing, is to say, I have one eventual goal, whether it's question answering, translation, text summarization, whatever you want to be doing. And what I want to do is have my eventual goal with the loss function, and I'm going to feed text in this end, and I'm going to build one huge end-to-end neural network, which may have some internal structure, but nevertheless, I'm going to optimize this whole network end-to-end, and that will maximize my performance and lead me to have this new high level of performance, and I'll be able to write a paper. So end-to-end is very appealing, and in some sense it might be right, because we have our brains going around the world and things happen, we see stuff, and somehow things get updated and changed, and maybe that is a kind of an end-to-end process. But it also feels that a lot of the time that can't possibly be the right model. Human beings do all sorts of different tasks, and it seems like there have to be different parts of your understanding and reasoning and processing which are repurposed for all kinds of different tasks. And so it seems like there have to be these modular components that you can combine together in different ways for doing different tasks, and that therefore it's not all trained end-to-end, except perhaps in some kind of overtime, gradual multitask process. And so I think we have to be starting to move to a world that's more like that, to produce sort of general intelligence and even just general language understanding ability, rather than here's a new system that can get a better score on this particular data set than the ones that came out last year.
So I actually agree 100% with you, and you made a comment again, I think it was at the SIG-IR conference, that you were worried about what you called, I think, the Kaggleization of machine learning. And it is interesting that the field is very driven by benchmark data sets, and we've both been involved in creating them. They're really useful for some things, but the way to succeed at those is to identify every bit of signal that is in one of those data sets and optimize it end to end. And I think one of the interesting things that has happened, at least in the last few years, is that for the newer models, people evaluate not just on one benchmark, but on many benchmarks. And so I think it is important that we start thinking about that kind of generalizability. And there may be more that we as a community can do in terms of, I don't know how those benchmarks come up. They usually come up because somebody wants to ask a particular question and there is no evaluation for it. But I don't think we have a great sense of what sample space of competencies those operate over. And so that seems like an interesting direction moving forward, to think about test collections which really the metrics drive performance and they drive innovation, but you also get what you measure. And so,
right, so there are two sort of parts of that, or thinking that's in my head. I mean, one part of it is that, referring to things as the Kaggleization of machine learning, is I have this fear that a lot of young people and students, certainly in terms of the education and experience they get through the school system. It might be different once they hit the real world, is that they totally miss so much of the problem and the science that they should be looking at, that really what should be happening is that there are interesting unsolved problems in the world. You want to be understanding something of the nature of those problems, and then it might be useful to be constructing some data set that is capturing some of what you can't do and making something that you could do. And so there's an enormous number of steps there and a lot of work in defining problems, defining what data you should collect, defining what would be good measures of success. And a lot of the time, students these days just don't see that and effectively are discouraged from seeing that because it's simultaneously both the easier thing to do and the easier way to get short-term success in the machine learning community to say, okay, well, here's this data set that somebody else used. I'll just download it and it's got whatever that's in it, and it's got whatever evaluation measure the last person used. And my only goal is to build a bigger, deeper neural network that'll score a higher number on that evaluation measure than the last person. And then I've got an easy path to my ICML on Europe's paper or something like that. And I think that that's effectively a very bad education that we're giving to a lot of students at the moment, when that's kind of the viewpoint they have as to how to go about things. So that's the sort of big picture concern. And then narrowly, close to what you were asking at the end, there's this, a lot of the work of the last few years have been, well, here's this one data set, okay, we're doing question answering, here's a data set, maybe it's the squad data set from Stanford or MS Marco from Microsoft, and my goal is to build and train end-to-end a system that performs better on that data set than the previous system. And the real problem there is it seems like we've had several years now of people gradually improving performance. So we have fantastic squad question answering systems or MS Marco answering systems, but these systems are really only, they're not question answering systems, they're squad question answering systems, and they don't actually generalize very well because they're very overfit to the particular characteristics of that one data set. And it seems like we really need to be starting to push natural language processing and also other related fields. It's the same story in computer vision, to actually trying to build question answering systems. And well, the most obvious way to do that is at least doing multi-domain systems, that we collect 10 different question answering data sets and say you should be building one question answering system that works well for all of those. But really we'd like to be able to do even more than that. We'd like to have something that transfers well to fresh tasks. I mean, a lot of human intelligence is that we can take a fresh problem and we haven't seen it at all, but we can say, oh, you know, here's this new game to play. It's a different game, but you know, it's not so dissimilar to tennis. You're hitting a ball with a racket, so I've got some idea of how to do that. Oh, look, this game, squash, it doesn't actually have a net, so it's not so important that I'm hitting it over something in the middle. And oh, look, I can bounce off the back wall. That's kind of interesting, right? So that you can kind of extend your knowledge by analogizing from what you have seen, but recognizing some of the new properties. And we need to start working out how to build systems that can do that.
Right. And certainly as you said, one way to start, and it's just a community problem, right? One way to start tackling that is to not just work on individual benchmarks, but to work on classes of problems. And I think we're seeing some of that. I think another, although it's hard to do from a corpus collection and creation perspective, is to build models that work from day to day to day. If you're running a web search engine, it doesn't matter if your model worked tomorrow and it doesn't work today. So we need to build models that are robust to non-stationarity and document collections and query streams. And it's not an easy challenge to address, but I think it's what is needed to move the field forward.
Yes, absolutely. And so the multitask evaluation is clearly something that's happening.
Right.
Sam Bowman, my former student who's now at NYU, has had quite a bit of success with his GLUE benchmark for natural language understanding, which has 10 different natural language understanding tasks, and I guess he's got a second version now, Super GLUE. And for question answering, I guess for the coming up MRQA machine reading for question answering workshop, they've sort of put together 10 question answering data sets. So that direction is heading successfully and sort of getting some generality there. I think the issue of non-stationary tasks and performance is a difficult one. I mean, something that a lot of the world has been very interested in, and I've becoming a bit more interested in, is doing things with dialogue systems.
Right.
And dialogue systems has been a very difficult area, and part of why it's a very difficult area is it's just not amenable to these fixed data sets, because dialogues can take all of these different parts, and you can't say, well, here's some dialogue data, make a system that works well on that dialogue data, because you have to be able to deal with fresh dialogues and the nature of everyone wants their dialogues to be topical, right? At the moment, people are wanting to talk about US-China trade friction, but next month, hopefully, they'll be talking about something else. And so you need to be able to sort of, change all the time. And so how can you build these models? How can you optimize them? How you can evaluate them? And I think we still don't have good answers to that. I mean, one answer is obviously reinforcement learning, and that's a field that is hugely expanded, is being applied a lot now. But it reflects the fact that it's that kind of a problem, that it seems like the only good way to evaluate dialogue systems at the moment is to be running them live and getting human impressions of whether things are working, that we just... in other areas of NLP, like question answering, the automatic evaluation measures may not be perfect, but they're definitely good enough that you can usefully experiment and build systems with them, where that just isn't true yet, I think, in areas like dialogue systems.
Good. Let me just wrap up with a question about advice that you'd give to students who are starting in the field. I think I've heard a little bit of it, which is to not just focus on existing data sets and just optimizing the heck out of those, but to think more broadly about problems, general tasks, robustness of algorithms. But how do you set that up at Stanford?
Right. So at the end of the day, there are clearly different ways to be successful in research. I mean, some people on the sort of more mathy spectrum, that if you are the kind of person that is going to think deep thoughts and prove theorems or develop new algorithms. I mean, clearly there are pathways in that direction, but for my own work, and I think advice for many people, that working from a problem-oriented direction is just a very successful way to work. And I mean, in particular, I think there's been kind of quite a bit of concern and discussion that in this current era of the late 2010s, where there's these huge companies which have 10 times as much compute, maybe 100 times as much compute as any university has. How can a PhD student at a university compete? And I think the answer is it's easy, but it gives some focus to what you have to do. Because, the wrong way to try and compete is to try and say, I'm going to build this big, huge model that takes weeks to train on 100 GPUs, and I'll be able to do that better than people at a huge tech company, because effectively you won't be able to, because you have less resources, and you will do it more slowly. But in what's in much scarcer supply is good ideas, and it's very easy to be successful doing things at a modest scale with good ideas. And, well, good ideas can be of several kinds. You can notice new things in the world which provide new problems, right? So there's lots of creativity in what's happening in the online world, and you can say, oh, well, look, there are these new websites that teenagers know about, but people of Sue and my age don't know about. And look, if you look in this new website and the way it works, there's this interesting different problem and opportunity where machine learning could be applied and something could be figured out and done. That could be a great problem. So there's finding fresh problems, and finding a fresh problem and presenting, both the problem and initial models of it. That's a really good way to be successful and have a lasting impact. But beyond that, the other way to do it is not to be saying, oh, I can build a bigger, deeper transformer network than the last person and therefore be successful, but to think, no, there are a lot of things we still don't understand about how to build successful models. So although there's been some exploration of how to put longer term memory into neural networks, that's very far from a solved area, and current systems really don't have much in the way of long-term memories. So what might be a good way to better put long-term memory into a neural network? That if you can come up with a neat novel idea to do that and demonstrate it in the small, well, then all the people at the big tech companies for the year after's conference will try out the same idea at a 10 times larger scale for you, but you'll get the credit for having come up with the original idea. So I think it's those kind of pathways are the ways to success.
Okay. Thanks. That's fabulous advice to the community and to forthcoming students. So, Chris, thanks so much for meeting with us today.